The grand ballroom of Thornhill Manor fell into a suffocating silence the moment the Duke appeared at the top of the marble staircase. Alexander Blackwood, the Duke of Thornhill, moved through the shadows like a phantom haunting his own estate, and the crowd of London's finest aristocracy instinctively parted before him as the Red Sea had parted for Moses. But this was no miracle born of reverence. This was fear. This was revulsion barely concealed behind painted fans and forced smiles. The left side of his face, once as handsome as any nobleman's, now bore the twisted topography of melted flesh and angry scars that crawled from his temple to his jaw, a grotesque map of the fire that had consumed not only his skin, but his entire future 3 years prior. Women turned their faces away. Men studied their champagne glasses with sudden fascination. Children, in their innocent cruelty, stared with wide eyes until their mothers yanked them close and whispered harsh admonishments. And Alexander felt every single one of those reactions like fresh burns upon old wounds, each averted gaze another confirmation that he was no longer a man but a monster, to be tolerated only because his title and fortune demanded it. In the far corner of that glittering ballroom, seated at a magnificent pianoforte that gleamed like liquid moonlight, Eleanor Ashford remained utterly unaware of the social theatre unfolding around her. Her world existed in darkness, had existed in darkness, since the fever took her sight at the age of 7, but it was a darkness rich with textures that the sighted would never comprehend. She heard the sudden hush fall over the room like a velvet curtain, felt the collective intake of breath, sensed the shift in energy that spoke of something significant, something feared. Her fingers continued their delicate dance across the ivory keys, coaxing out a Chopin nocturne that seemed to be the only sound brave enough to exist in the Duke's presence. Eleanor had been hired for this evening through her modest music teacher, a charitable woman who had taken pity on a blind girl from a family of little consequence and even less fortune. This position, playing for the Duke of Thornhill's first social gathering in 3 years, represented more than an evening's wages. It represented possibility, the chance that her talent might finally be the key to lifting her family from the genteel poverty that had defined her entire existence. I am so glad you have found your way here, to this story of shadows and light, of scars both visible and hidden. If you are enjoying this journey into Regency England, please take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. For it truly helps me continue bringing these stories to life for you. The ballroom's atmosphere remained tense as the evening progressed, a strange contradiction of forced gaiety layered over genuine unease. Eleanor played through her carefully prepared repertoire, aware that she was performing but unable to gauge her audience's reception beyond the occasional polite applause that sounded more obligatory than appreciative. She did not know that the Duke himself had positioned himself in an alcove where he could observe her without being observed in return, his scarred face half hidden by shadows he now preferred to any light. There was something about the young woman at the piano that arrested his attention in a way nothing had in years. Perhaps it was the serene expression on her face as she played, so utterly devoid of the pity or horror he had grown accustomed to seeing. Perhaps it was the way her head tilted slightly, as if she were listening to something beyond the music itself, some melody that existed in a realm only she could access. Or perhaps it was simply that she had not once looked in his direction, had not once flinched or gasped or turned away because she could not see him at all. The tragedy that had created the Duke's disfigurement was still whispered about in London's drawing rooms, though never in his presence. 3 years ago, Alexander Blackwood had been engaged to Lady Catherine Pemberton, a beauty of impeccable lineage and a match approved by every level of society. The week before their wedding, a fire had engulfed the east wing of Thornhill Manor in the dead of night. Alexander had rushed into the flames to save his future bride, who had been staying at the estate as a guest. He had found her, had dragged her unconscious form through corridors of smoke and heat, but a collapsing beam had struck him across the face and pinned him down. By the time his servants pulled him free, the left side of his face had been destroyed. Catherine had survived without a scratch. And 3 days after awakening to see her intended's ruined face, she had broken their engagement, with a letter so cold it might have been written with icicles for ink, citing her inability to bind herself to a man whose appearance would cause her nothing but distress for the remainder of her days. That rejection, so public and so absolute, had transformed Alexander from a man of warmth and easy charm into the cold, bitter recluse who now presided over Thornhill Manor like a dragon guarding cursed gold. He had learned that beauty was currency in their world, and he was now bankrupt. He had learned that love was conditional, and his condition no longer met the requirements. Tonight's ball was not his choice, but his mother's insistence, her desperate attempt to reintegrate her son into a society that had already written him off as a cautionary tale. And as Alexander watched Eleanor Ashford play, watched her exist in her world of darkness, with more grace than any of the cited guests in his ballroom, something long dormant stirred within his chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The evening had progressed into its later hours, when Eleanor finally rose from the pianoforte, her fingers tired but her heart content with the knowledge that she had performed well, regardless of how the invisible audience had received her music. Her teacher, Mrs. Hartley, had instructed her to take refreshment in the servants' hall after her performance, but Eleanor, disoriented in this unfamiliar grand house, had taken a wrong turn somewhere in the labyrinth of corridors. She found herself in what she sensed was a conservatory, the air thick with the perfume of night-blooming flowers, and the temperature noticeably cooler, suggesting glass walls that separated her from the outside world. Her fingers trailed along what felt like a marble balustrade, seeking some landmark that might orient her back toward the path she should have taken. The gentle night breeze carried the distant sound of the orchestra that had replaced her at the pianoforte, and she paused, allowing herself a moment to simply breathe in this small pocket of solitude, away from the overwhelming sensory experience of a house filled with strangers. She did not hear him approach, for Alexander Blackwood had learned to move with the silence of a ghost through his own home, preferring to avoid encounters that would necessitate watching people's faces contort with barely concealed revulsion. He had retreated to the conservatory for the same reason Eleanor had accidentally discovered it, seeking refuge from the suffocating falseness of the ballroom where everyone pretended not to notice his face while noticing nothing else. When he saw her there, silhouetted against the moonlight streaming through the glass panels, he froze, uncertain whether to announce his presence or simply retreat back into the shadows. The decision was made for him when Eleanor, taking another step forward in her careful exploration, collided directly with his chest, her hands flying up instinctively to steady herself against what she must have assumed was a pillar or piece of furniture, only to discover the warm solidity of a man's waistcoat beneath her palms. The apology tumbled from her lips immediately, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment at her clumsiness, and she stepped back quickly, her hands still extended slightly, as if to maintain awareness of where he stood in relation to her position. Alexander found himself unable to speak, transfixed by the fact that her face showed only mortification at her social blunder, not the slightest hint of horror at whom she had collided with. And then Eleanor did something that would alter the trajectory of both their lives irrevocably. She asked, with a hesitancy that spoke of someone accustomed to being refused, if she might touch his face, explaining in a voice barely above a whisper that this was how she truly saw people, how she created portraits in her mind of those she encountered. She had recognized his expensive cologne, the quality of his clothing's fabric, and understood she had stumbled upon someone of great importance, perhaps even the Duke himself, and she wished to apologize properly, to see to whom she was speaking. Alexander Blackwood had spent 3 years ensuring that no one came close enough to truly examine the ruin of his face, turning away from even his own reflection. And yet here stood this slip of a girl asking permission to do exactly what he most feared. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to send her away, to retreat back into his armor of isolation. But something in her unseeing eyes, something in the genuine innocence of her request, made him give the barest nod of assent before remembering she could not see the gesture, and so he forced out a single word of permission, his voice rusty from disuse and thick with an emotion he could not name. Eleanor's smile at his consent was like sunrise breaking over a landscape that had known only night, and she stepped forward again, raising her hands with a delicacy that suggested she understood the profound trust he was placing in her. Her fingertips touched his right cheek first, the unmarred side tracing the aristocratic cheekbone, the strong jaw, the straight nose, and Alexander held himself rigid as stone, hardly daring to breathe. Then her exploration moved to the left side, and he braced for the moment when her expression would change, when she would feel the ridged and twisted flesh and understand what everyone else saw when they looked at him. But Eleanor's face remained serene, concentrated, her touch neither hesitant nor repulsed as her fingers mapped the geography of his scars with the same gentle thoroughness she had given to the undamaged side. When she finally lowered her hands, she pronounced him with complete sincerity as having a strong face, a noble face, the face of someone who had endured something terrible and survived it, which she suggested made him far more interesting than all the smooth, unmarked faces that likely populated his ballroom. And for the first time since the fire, Alexander Blackwood felt seen not as a monster, but as a man. The weeks following that fateful encounter in the conservatory brought changes to Thornhill Manor that the servants whispered about in corners and corridors, changes so profound they seemed to shift the very atmosphere of the great house. Alexander Blackwood, who had not smiled in 3 years, found the corners of his mouth lifting at unexpected moments. The Duke, who had barricaded himself in his study from dawn until dusk, now kept his doors open and occasionally walked through his own gardens in daylight hours. And at the center of this quiet transformation was Eleanor Ashford, whom the Duke had hired as his personal pianist, with a salary so generous that her family's financial troubles evaporated like morning mist. 3 times a week, Eleanor arrived at Thornhill Manor in the Duke's own carriage, a luxury that still made her breath catch with disbelief, and she would spend hours playing for him in his private music room, a space he had opened for the first time since the fire. What began as simple musical performances gradually evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. Alexander found himself talking to Eleanor in ways he had not spoken to another human being since his disfigurement, sharing thoughts and observations he had assumed would remain locked inside him forever. There was a freedom in speaking to someone who could not see his face, who could not watch his scars twist when he smiled or spoke, who responded only to his words and the tone in which he delivered them. He told her about his childhood, about his travels through Europe before the fire, about his love of literature and his secret passion for astronomy. Eleanor, in turn, shared her own world with him, describing how she experienced music not just as sound but as color and texture, how each composer painted different landscapes in her mind, how Beethoven felt like mountains and Mozart like sunlight on water. Their growing friendship did not go unnoticed by London society, though the interpretation of it varied wildly, depending on who was doing the observing. Some saw it as further evidence of the Duke's descent into eccentricity, that he would spend so much time with a blind girl of no consequence, rather than attempting to rejoin proper society. Others viewed it with something darker, suggesting that Eleanor Ashford was a clever opportunist who had identified the Duke's vulnerability and was exploiting it for financial gain, using her blindness as a weapon to appeal to a man whose face repelled everyone else. The cruelest whispers suggested that she was fortunate to be blind, for it meant she could tolerate his company without the revulsion that any sighted woman would feel, implying that her acceptance of him was not virtue, but merely the absence of alternative. Eleanor remained blissfully unaware of most of these rumors, living as she did in her modest family home, and traveling only between there and Thornhill Manor. But her younger sister, Margaret, heard them at the marketplace and brought them home like poison wrapped in concern. Margaret warned Eleanor that she was becoming too familiar with the Duke, that people were talking, that their family's reputation, already fragile due to their poverty, could not withstand the scandal of Eleanor being seen as the Duke's charity case, or worse, his mistress. But Eleanor, who had spent her entire life being told what she could not do, what she could not achieve, what she could not be because of her blindness, found in her friendship with Alexander something she had never experienced before. Someone who valued her for exactly who she was, who listened to her thoughts as if they mattered, who made her feel seen in ways that had nothing to do with physical sight. Alexander, for his part, found himself facing a realization that terrified him more than any fire had. He was falling in love with Eleanor Ashford. It was not a sudden lightning strike, but a gradual dawn, creeping up on him through 100 small moments, the way she laughed at his dry observations, the way she turned her face toward him when he entered a room, as if she could sense his presence, the way she argued with him about philosophy and literature, with a passion that suggested she had forgotten she was speaking to a duke and remembered only that she was speaking to Alexander. But with this realization came a crushing weight of impossibility. What could he offer her except a life of being stared at and pitied as the blind girl who had married the monster duke? What right did he have to bind her to him when society would make her life a misery for that choice? And yet the thought of her eventually marrying someone else, of losing these afternoons of music and conversation, felt like contemplating a second fire, one that would consume what remained of his heart. The turning point came on an afternoon in late spring, when the music room felt thick with unspoken tension, as if the very air between them had become charged with electricity waiting for a storm to break. Eleanor had been playing Schumann, pieces that spoke of longing and unfulfilled desire, and when her hands finally stilled on the keys, the silence that followed felt more profound than any music. Alexander sat in his usual chair near the window, but today he had moved it closer to the pianoforte than ever before, close enough that Eleanor could sense his presence like warmth from a fire. She turned on the bench to face where she knew he sat, and asked him a question that had been building in her heart for weeks. Why did he hide from the world? Why did he let the opinions of people who did not matter dictate how he lived his life? Why did he imprison himself in this beautiful house, as if his scars were crimes that required solitude as punishment? Her words, so direct and unadorned by the careful politeness that everyone else employed around him, struck Alexander like physical blows, but they were blows that broke through walls rather than building them higher. He found himself rising from his chair, pacing to the window, his hands clenched behind his back as he struggled with whether to answer honestly or to deflect with the cold dismissiveness he had perfected over 3 years of isolation. But Eleanor had given him the gift of her honesty, had offered him her true self without pretense or pity, and she deserved the same in return. And so, with his back still turned to her, with his voice raw and breaking in places he could not control, Alexander told her everything. He told her about Catherine, about how the woman he had loved and planned to marry had looked at his burned face and seen only horror, had sent him a letter ending their engagement before he had even left his sickbed. He told her about the social events he had attempted to attend in those first months after the fire, about the way conversations would die when he approached, about the children who cried, about the women who fainted, about the men who could not meet his eyes. He told her that he had learned a fundamental truth about their world, that beauty was currency and love was transactional, and when you lost the former, you forfeited any right to the latter. He told her that he had accepted his role as a cautionary tale, as the tragic duke who served as a reminder to others, about the fragility of fortune and appearance. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he told her the truth he had been hiding even from himself, that these afternoons with her had become the only light in his darkness, that her music and her conversation and her complete inability to judge him by his appearance had made him remember what it felt like to be human rather than monster, and that he was terrified of the day when she would inevitably grow tired of spending time with a recluse. Say a scarred duke and move on to a life that included people who could actually be seen with her in public without causing scandal. Eleanor rose from the piano bench during his confession, her hand trailing along the pianoforte's edge to orient herself, and she moved toward his voice with the confidence of someone navigating familiar territory. She found him by the window, found his arm and then found his hand, lacing her fingers through his with a firmness that suggested she had no intention of letting go. She told him, with a fierce intensity that made her voice shake, that he was the biggest fool in all of England if he truly believed that beauty resided only in unmarred skin and symmetrical features. She told him that she had touched the faces of many supposedly handsome men, men whose smooth features hid cruel hearts and empty minds, and that she had found his face, with all its history written in scar tissue, to be more beautiful because it told a story of courage and survival. She told him that she did not pity him, she admired him, and if he wanted to know the real truth, she had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with him, and she did not care one bit what London society thought about it. Alexander turned to face her then, this woman who could not see the tears streaming down both sides of his face, the scarred side and the unscarred side weeping equally, and he pulled her into his arms with a desperation that spoke of a man who had been drowning and had suddenly found air. He held her as if she might disappear, as if she might be a dream his lonely mind had conjured, and he whispered into her hair that he loved her, that he had loved her for weeks, but had been too much of a coward to admit it, that she had saved him in ways she could not possibly understand. And Eleanor, her face pressed against his chest where she could hear his heart racing, smiled with a joy so pure it seemed to illuminate the entire room, and she told him that she understood perfectly, because he had saved her too, had given her a place where her blindness was not a limitation, but simply another way of seeing, where she was valued not despite her disability, but as a complete person whose worth had nothing to do with what she could not see. In the days following their mutual confession, Alexander Blackwood underwent a transformation that even his longtime servants found remarkable, as if the man they had known before the fire had somehow found his way back from whatever distant shore grief and bitterness had exiled him to. He laughed again, not the bitter sound that occasionally escaped him, but genuine laughter that echoed through Thornhill Manor's corridors like music. He made plans, spoke of the future in terms that included hope rather than mere endurance, and most tellingly, he began to speak of marriage. Alexander knew that asking Eleanor to be his wife would invite a storm of social condemnation, that it would expose her to the cruelty and judgment of a society that would never understand why a young woman would choose a scarred recluse over any of the unmarred gentlemen who might court her. But he also knew with a certainty that felt like bedrock beneath his feet that he could not imagine his future without her in it, that these past months had shown him what his life could be when shared with someone who truly saw him. Eleanor, when he proposed to her one afternoon in the music room where they had spent so many hours together, accepted before he had even finished asking the question, her yes tumbling out with such enthusiasm that it made him laugh and cry simultaneously. She cared nothing for the social complications, nothing for the gossip that would surely follow, nothing for the warnings her own family had already begun issuing about the impropriety of her situation. All she cared about was that the man she loved wanted to build a life with her, wanted to wake beside her every morning and fall asleep beside her every night, wanted to give her his name and his heart and his future. They set a date for 6 weeks hence, time enough to arrange a proper ceremony, but not so long that either of them had to wait in unbearable anticipation, and Alexander immediately dispatched announcements to London's newspapers and letters to the few family members and friends whose opinions still mattered to him. The reaction from London society was precisely as catastrophic as Alexander had anticipated, perhaps even worse. The announcement of the Duke of Thornhill's engagement to Miss Eleanor Ashford, a blind pianist of modest origins, detonated like a bomb in drawing rooms across Mayfair. The charitable interpretation, whispered by those who still held some residual affection for the Duke, was that his isolation and disfigurement had driven him to madness, that he was making a desperate decision based on gratitude to the only person willing to spend time with him. The less charitable and far more prevalent interpretation painted Eleanor as a cunning opportunist who had manipulated a vulnerable man, using her blindness as a tactical advantage to ensnare a duke who no sighted woman would have. The cruelest voices suggested it was a perfect match, a blind woman and a man too hideous to look at, two damaged creatures settling for each other because no one else would have them. These whispers reached Eleanor's ears through her sister Margaret, who arrived at their modest home one afternoon with a face pale with distress and a collection of gossip so vicious it made Eleanor's hands shake with anger. Margaret begged her older sister to reconsider, to understand that marrying the Duke would not elevate their family's position, but rather cement them as objects of pity and ridicule, that Eleanor would spend her life being stared at and gossiped about, that she would never be accepted by the society she was marrying into. But Eleanor, with a steel in her voice that Margaret had never heard before, told her sister that she would rather be gossiped about while living a life of genuine love and partnership than be approved of while living a life of loneliness and pretense. She told Margaret that the people who mocked her engagement were the same people who had ignored her existence her entire life, who had dismissed her as a pitiable blind girl with no prospects, and their opinions now held exactly as much weight as they always had, which was none at all. Alexander, meanwhile, was experiencing his own confrontations with those who presumed to know what was best for him. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, arrived at Thornhill Manor in a state of agitation that manifested in rapid speech and hand-wringing, imploring her son to postpone the wedding, to give himself more time to consider whether he was making this decision out of love or out of loneliness and gratitude. His few remaining friends from before the fire sent carefully worded letters, suggesting that while they were happy, he had found companionship, perhaps a formal engagement was premature, perhaps Miss Ashford could remain as his companion without the legal and social complications of marriage. Even his solicitor, a man known for his discretion, felt compelled to point out that the Duke might wish to consider a longer courtship period to ensure that Miss Ashford's affections were genuine and not motivated by the significant improvement in circumstances that marriage to a duke would provide. To all of these concerns, to all of these thinly veiled suggestions that Eleanor was somehow unworthy or duplicitous, or that he was making a mistake, Alexander responded with a coldness that reminded everyone who heard it that beneath his scars and his recent gentleness, he was still a duke with the power and authority that title conferred, and his decision was final. As the wedding date approached with the inevitability of a turning tide, Alexander found himself wrestling with a decision that would either validate Eleanor's worth in the eyes of society or potentially subject her to even greater humiliation than the whispers already afforded her. He could marry her quietly in a small ceremony at Thornhill Manor's private chapel, protecting her from the scrutiny of London's elite, but also confirming society's belief that he was ashamed of his choice, that Eleanor was something to be hidden away like his scars. Or he could do what every part of his protective instinct screamed against. He could insist on a grand society wedding, could force every member of the ton who had snubbed him and gossiped about Eleanor to witness their union, could make their marriage the social event of the season, and dare anyone to question it. The risk was enormous, for it would expose Eleanor to the stares and whispers and barely concealed contempt of hundreds of people who had already judged her and found her wanting. Eleanor, when he presented her with the choice, did not hesitate for even a moment. She told him that she had spent her entire life being invisible to society, being overlooked and dismissed, and treated as if her blindness somehow made her less than fully human, and she had no intention of beginning her marriage by confirming those beliefs. She told him that she wanted the grandest wedding London had ever seen, wanted to walk down the aisle of St. George's Chapel in Mayfair, where all the most prestigious weddings took place, wanted every duke and duchess and lord and lady who had whispered about them to be forced to attend and witness their happiness. She told him, with a smile that held more courage than fear, that she was not ashamed of loving him, and she would not allow anyone else's narrow-minded prejudice to make her feel as though she should be. And so Alexander, his heart swelling with pride and terror in equal measure, began planning a wedding that would either be his bride's triumph or her social execution. The invitations that went out to London's elite were not requests, but commands, worded with the formal authority of a duke who expected attendance and would remember those who failed to appear. Alexander leveraged every political connection, every business relationship, every old family tie to ensure that the pews of St. George's would be filled with precisely the people whose opinions shaped society's judgments. He wanted them there, wanted them to see Eleanor, wanted to watch their faces when they realized that the blind pianist they had dismissed was about to become one of the most powerful women in England. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, threw herself into the wedding preparations with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, perhaps motivated by maternal love, or perhaps by a determination to prove that her son's choice was not the disaster everyone predicted, and she ensured that no detail was overlooked, that the ceremony would be flawless and magnificent in every particular. The week before the wedding, Eleanor moved temporarily into the Dowager Duchess's London townhouse, as tradition dictated that the bride and groom should not see each other in the days immediately preceding the ceremony. In that elegant house, Eleanor found herself the subject of intense preparation, as modistes and hairstylists and jewelers descended upon her with the mission of transforming her into a duchess. The wedding gown they created for her was a masterpiece of white silk and Belgian lace, with seed pearls sewn across the bodice in patterns that Eleanor could trace with her fingers, creating a tactile beauty that she could appreciate even if she could never see it. The Dowager Duchess presented her with the Thornhill diamonds, a necklace and earring set that had been worn by every Duchess of Thornhill for 5 generations, and as she fastened the heavy necklace around Eleanor's throat, she whispered that Eleanor had given her back her son, and for that alone she would be forever grateful. But even as Eleanor sat for fittings and allowed herself to be adorned with jewels and silk, the whispers of London society grew louder and more vicious, as if the approaching wedding had given people permission to voice their cruelest thoughts without restraint. Betting books at the gentlemen's clubs filled with wagers on how long the marriage would last, with some particularly cruel souls wagering that Eleanor would leave the Duke the moment she inherited his money, or that Alexander would come to his senses and seek an annulment within the year. Ladies who had never spoken Eleanor's name suddenly had detailed opinions about her character, her motives and her unsuitability for the position she was about to assume. The consensus among London's elite seemed to be that they were about to witness not a wedding but a spectacle, a confirmation of how far the once proud Duke of Thornhill had fallen, and they would attend not to celebrate, but to observe his humiliation, and perhaps to feel superior in comparison to his desperation. The morning of the wedding dawned with the kind of perfect English spring weather that seemed almost orchestrated by Providence itself, with clear skies and gentle sunlight that poured through the windows of the Dowager Duchess's townhouse, where Eleanor was being prepared for the ceremony. Her hands trembled slightly as the ladies' maids helped her into the magnificent gown, as the weight of the Thornhill diamonds settled against her collarbone, as her hair was arranged in an elaborate style that she could only experience through the gentle tugging and pinning she felt against her scalp. The Dowager Duchess herself came to Eleanor's room in the final moments before they were to depart for the church, and she took Eleanor's hands in her own, telling her that she had been wrong to ever doubt this union, that she had watched her son transform from a bitter ghost into a living man again because of Eleanor's love, and that she was proud beyond measure to welcome her as a daughter. The journey to St. George's Chapel felt both endless and far too brief, and Eleanor could hear through the carriage windows the sounds of crowds gathering, for word had spread throughout London that the Duke of Thornhill's wedding would be a spectacle worth witnessing. When the carriage finally stopped and the door opened, when Eleanor was helped down onto the pavement, with her hand tucked into the Dowager Duchess's arm since her own father had passed years ago, she could hear the rustle and murmur of hundreds of people, could sense the weight of their collective stare like physical pressure against her skin. She held her head high, her face serene despite the nervousness that made her heart race, and she walked toward the church entrance with steady steps, refusing to show any of the fear or uncertainty that society expected from her. Inside the chapel, the pews were indeed filled with exactly the audience Alexander had insisted upon. Every important family in London, every title holder who mattered, every society matron whose approval or disapproval could make or break a reputation. They sat in their finery, their faces arranged in expressions of polite interest that barely concealed their judgment and their anticipation of witnessing what they believed would be a tragic mistake. The whispers that had circulated for weeks now manifested as actual voices, barely contained murmurs that rippled through the assembled crowd as Eleanor appeared at the entrance of the chapel, a vision in white silk and diamonds that many of them were seeing for the first time, since they had never bothered to actually meet the woman they had spent so much time gossiping about. Some were surprised by her youth and her beauty, having assumed that a blind pianist of no consequence would be plain and perhaps even unfortunate in appearance, and their surprise manifested as confused whispers that suggested perhaps they had misjudged the situation, though most still clung to their original interpretations. At the altar, Alexander stood waiting for his bride, and for the first time in 3 years he had positioned himself so that his scarred side was fully visible to the congregation rather than angled away in the shadows. He wore his formal dress uniform from his brief military service, dark and decorated with the medals and insignia of his rank and title, and he had made the deliberate choice not to let his hair fall across his scars, not to position himself in dim lighting, not to hide in any of the ways he had perfected over the long months of his isolation. If society was going to witness his wedding, they would see all of him, scars and all, and they would see him claim Eleanor as his wife with pride rather than shame. His hands were steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do, despite knowing that the next few minutes would either silence his critics or confirm their worst predictions, and his eyes were locked on the entrance of the chapel, waiting for the moment when Eleanor would appear. And then the organ began to play, a triumphant processional that filled the vaulted space of St. George's with sound, and Eleanor began her walk down the aisle on the Dowager Duchess's arm, moving with a grace that came from years of navigating the world without sight, her face turned toward where she knew Alexander waited for her, even though she could not see him. The congregation fell into absolute silence, the kind of silence that is not peaceful, but rather charged with anticipation and judgment, and every eye in the chapel watched as the blind pianist, who had been dismissed as a fortune hunter, as a manipulator, as a desperate woman settling for a monster, walked toward her future with her head held high and a smile on her face that spoke of genuine joy rather than resignation. Some in the audience felt the first stirrings of doubt about their assumptions. Some felt the uncomfortable realization that perhaps they had been wrong, and some clung stubbornly to their original judgments, because to change them now would require admitting they had been cruel and narrow-minded. Eleanor reached the altar, after what felt like both an eternity and an instant, and when the Dowager Duchess placed Eleanor's hand into Alexander's waiting palm, the connection between them was so palpable that even the most cynical observers in the congregation could not deny the electricity that seemed to arc between bride and groom. Alexander's fingers closed around Eleanor's with a gentleness that contradicted his imposing physical presence, and he leaned down to whisper something to her that no one else could hear, something that made her smile widen and her shoulders relax, a private moment of intimacy in the midst of this very public spectacle. The bishop began the ceremony with the traditional words that had joined countless couples before them, his voice resonant in the chapel's acoustics, and the congregation settled into their seats with the rustle of expensive fabrics and the subtle clearing of throats, prepared to endure a ceremony they had attended out of obligation rather than celebration. But Alexander Blackwood had not brought London society to St. George's Chapel simply to perform a traditional ceremony and send them on their way to a wedding breakfast where they could continue their gossip in more comfortable surroundings. When the bishop reached the point in the ceremony where he asked if anyone present knew of any lawful impediment to this marriage, the traditional moment that was almost always met with silence, Alexander did something unprecedented. He turned away from Eleanor, turned to face the congregation directly with his scarred face fully illuminated by the light streaming through the stained glass windows, and he spoke with a voice that carried to every corner of the chapel, a voice that commanded attention and demanded to be heard. He told them that he knew exactly what they had been saying about his bride, about Eleanor Ashford, the woman he was about to make his duchess. He told them he knew the whispers, the cruel speculation, the assumptions about her character and her motives. He told them, with a precision that made several society matrons blanch visibly, that he had heard the rumors that she was a fortune hunter, that she had manipulated him, that she only accepted him because her blindness prevented her from seeing what everyone else saw when they looked at his face. And then, with a passion that made his voice crack with emotion, he told them the truth. He told them that Eleanor Ashford was the bravest, most compassionate, most brilliant woman he had ever known, that she had seen him more clearly in her darkness than anyone with perfect sight had ever managed, that she had looked past his title and his wealth and his scars to see the man beneath, and that was a gift more precious than all the riches in England. He told them that if they believed she was settling for him out of desperation or limited options, they were the blind ones, for it was he who was receiving the greatest gift, he who was unworthy of her, but grateful beyond measure that she had chosen him anyway. The chapel had fallen into a silence so profound that the sound of a single person breathing seemed loud, and faces that had been arranged in expressions of polite boredom or barely concealed disdain now showed shock, discomfort, and in some cases, the beginning of shame. Alexander was not finished. He told them that Eleanor had taught him what true beauty meant, that it had nothing to do with an unmarred face or a prestigious lineage, that it resided in kindness and courage and the capacity to see worth in places where others saw only liability. He told them that he had been more blind when he had perfect sight than Eleanor had ever been in her darkness, for he had valued all the wrong things, had believed that society's approval mattered more than genuine connection, and it had taken losing his face to finally understand what truly mattered. And then he told them, with a finality that left no room for argument, that he was proud to marry Eleanor Ashford, that he would spend the rest of his life proving himself worthy of her, and that anyone who could not accept her as his duchess and treat her with the respect that position commanded was no longer welcome in his life or his home. The silence that followed his declaration was broken only by Eleanor herself, who reached up to find Alexander's face with her hands, who traced the scars on his cheek with her fingertips in full view of everyone watching, and who then stood on her toes to kiss him gently before they had even been officially pronounced husband and wife, a gesture so tender and so utterly devoid of shame or hesitation that it shattered whatever remaining doubts injured in the minds of those assembled. The bishop, flustered but moved, hurried through the remaining elements of the ceremony, and when he finally pronounced them man and wife and invited the groom to kiss his bride, Alexander pulled Eleanor into his arms and kissed her with a passion that left no doubt about the genuine nature of their feelings for one another, and the congregation, despite themselves, despite their prejudices and their gossip and their cruel assumptions, found themselves applauding. The wedding breakfast that followed at Thornhill House was an affair that would be discussed in London drawing rooms for years to come, not because of its opulence, though it was indeed magnificent, but because of the profound shift in atmosphere that had occurred between the ceremony and the celebration. The same people who had arrived at the church, prepared to witness a spectacle of desperation, now found themselves genuinely celebrating a union that had moved them despite their resistance to being moved. Alexander and Eleanor received their guests in the grand ballroom where they had first met, where Eleanor had played the pianoforte months ago as an invisible musician. And now she stood as the Duchess of Thornhill, radiant in her wedding gown and diamonds, her hand firmly clasped in her husband's, as they greeted each guest with a grace that suggested they had been born to stand together exactly as they were. The most remarkable transformations occurred among those who had been the most vocal critics of the match. Lady Pemberton, whose daughter Catherine had broken Alexander's engagement 3 years prior, approached the receiving line with visible trepidation, her face pale as she offered her congratulations, with a voice that shook slightly. Eleanor, who had been told the full story of Catherine's rejection, responded with a kindness that was more devastating than any cut could have been, thanking Lady Pemberton for attending and expressing hope that they might become better acquainted in the future. The graciousness of that response, the complete absence of vindictiveness or superiority, left Lady Pemberton with tears in her eyes as she moved away from the couple, and she was heard later telling another guest that the Duke had chosen far better than her daughter deserved, and that Catherine's rejection might have been the greatest mistake of her life. Throughout the celebration, Eleanor proved herself to be far more than the pitiful blind girl that society had imagined. She navigated the ballroom with Alexander at her side, but she also held conversations independently, demonstrating a wit and intelligence that surprised those who had assumed her disability would limit her capacity in every arena. She discussed literature with scholars, music theory with composers, and even politics with several lords who found themselves unexpectedly engaged in debates with the new Duchess. Her blindness, rather than being the limitation everyone had assumed, seemed almost incidental to her presence, merely one characteristic among many rather than the defining feature of her existence. And Alexander watched her charm and impress his guests with a pride so evident on his face that even his scars could not diminish it, and he made certain that everyone who spoke with Eleanor understood that she was not merely his wife, but his equal partner in every meaningful way. The moment that truly sealed Eleanor's acceptance into society, the moment that transformed her from an object of pity into an object of admiration, came when she was asked by several guests if she would play for them, and she agreed with the condition that Alexander would turn the pages of her music for her. The symbolism of that image, the Duke of Thornhill standing beside his blind wife at the pianoforte, attending to her needs while she filled the ballroom with music of such extraordinary beauty that conversation stopped and people simply listened, was more powerful than any speech could have been. Here was a partnership, genuine and mutual, where each person supported the other without shame or hesitation. Eleanor's performance was transcendent, her fingers coaxing from the instrument emotions that seemed to speak directly to the hearts of everyone listening. And when she finished, the applause was not polite obligation, but genuine appreciation. As the evening drew to a close and guests began to depart, the farewells they offered were markedly different from the stiff greetings they had extended upon arrival. People who had come prepared to gossip left instead with stories of having witnessed something rare and precious, a love match that defied convention and expectation in the best possible way. The social arbiters of London, those powerful matrons whose approval could make or break a reputation, found themselves revising their opinions, admitting in whispers to one another that perhaps they had been too hasty in their judgments, that the Duke's choice had been not madness but wisdom, that Eleanor Ashford, now Eleanor Blackwood, Duchess of Thornhill, was exactly the kind of woman who deserved such a position. The ton, which had gathered to witness what they believed would be a cautionary tale about desperation and poor judgment, left instead having witnessed a triumph of love over prejudice, of substance over superficiality, and many of them felt uncomfortably aware of their own shallowness in comparison. The months and years that followed Eleanor's transformation from invisible pianist to celebrated duchess became the stuff of legend in London society, a story that mothers told their daughters about the importance of character over appearance, and that fathers referenced when discussing the true meaning of nobility. Eleanor did not simply occupy the position of duchess, she redefined it, using her platform and Alexander's resources to establish a music conservatory specifically for blind children, giving them opportunities and training that had been denied to so many like her. She became an advocate for those whom society overlooked, the disabled and the poor and the dismissed, and her advocacy carried weight precisely because she spoke from experience rather than abstract charity. Alexander stood beside her in all these endeavors, his own experience of being cast out by society, making him the perfect partner for a woman determined to change how society treated those it deemed lesser. Thornhill Manor, which had been a place of shadows and isolation for 3 terrible years, became known as one of London's most welcoming estates, where the guest lists included not just the predictable aristocracy, but artists and musicians and scholars regardless of their social standing, where merit mattered more than pedigree. The Blackwoods hosted salons that became legendary for their intellectual stimulation and their inclusivity, and invitations to Thornhill Manor became among the most coveted in London, not because of the Duke's title, but because of the genuine warmth and fascinating company one would find there. Eleanor's blindness, which society had initially viewed as a tragic limitation, became almost incidental to her identity as one of London's most influential women, and those who had pitied her found themselves seeking her counsel and her friendship. The Duke himself underwent a transformation that was visible to anyone who had known him before and after his marriage. The bitterness and isolation that had defined him after the fire gradually dissolved under the steady influence of Eleanor's love and partnership, and while his scars remained as visible as ever, they ceased to define him in the eyes of society, and more importantly, in his own perception of himself. He began to venture out in public without the old self-consciousness, attending Parliament and social events with Eleanor on his arm, and he discovered that when he stopped hiding and started living, people responded to his confidence rather than his disfigurement. The tragedy that had once seemed like the end of his life revealed itself to be a refining fire that had burned away superficiality and left behind something far more valuable: authenticity and the capacity to recognize true worth when he found it. 3 years after their wedding, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter whom they named Catherine Grace, a name that raised eyebrows among those who remembered Alexander's former fiancée, but which the Duke explained was meant to honor not the woman who had rejected him, but the concept of grace itself, the unmerited favor that had brought Eleanor into his life. The child was born with perfect sight, though Eleanor laughingly told visitors that it hardly mattered since she had learned that the most important things in life were seen with the heart rather than the eyes. The Blackwood family became a fixture of London society, their story evolving from scandal to inspiration, proof that the most unlikely matches could become the strongest marriages when built on genuine understanding and mutual respect rather than social expectation and surface attraction. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of Eleanor and Alexander's story, Though of course it was not truly an ending, but rather a beginning, the start of a life built on foundations that society had insisted were impossible. Their tale reminds us of truths we often forget in our modern world, truths that are no less relevant now than they were in Regency England. We live in a time that still judges by appearances, that still values the superficial over the substantial, that still dismisses people based on what they lack, rather than celebrating what they possess. How many times have you felt invisible, overlooked, underestimated, because you did not fit someone else's narrow definition of worthy? How many times have you hidden your own scars, whether physical or emotional, because you feared rejection? Eleanor's story teaches us that our value is not determined by society's approval, but by our own character, our own courage, our own capacity to love and be loved authentically. And Alexander's journey reminds us that the worst thing that ever happens to us can also be the catalyst that burns away our illusions and reveals what truly matters. So as you go about your life, remember the blind pianist who asked to touch the face that everyone else feared. Remember the scarred duke who learned that being seen truly matters more than being seen as beautiful. And remember that the love and acceptance you seek begins not with changing yourself to fit others' expectations, but with having the courage to be wholly, authentically yourself, and trusting that the right people will recognize your why, exactly as you are. Your scars, whether visible or hidden, are not flaws to be ashamed of, but stories of survival to be honored. And somewhere in this world, there is someone who will ask permission to trace them with gentle fingers and tell you that they make you beautiful.